They thought breaking her chair would break her. They laughed. They whispered. They wanted her shattered right there on the marble floor of a Manhattan penthouse, in the only simple black dress she owned. But what they didn't know, the man whose name made all of New York lower its voice was standing right behind that door, and he saw everything, every laugh, every look of contempt, every second that passed without a single person in that room full of champagne and diamonds reaching out a hand to his wife. And when he walked in, the room that had been roaring with laughter went dead silent, not because he yelled, not because he threatened, but because there are people whose silence is more terrifying than any scream. Her name was Genevieve, 27 years old, a vintage watch repairwoman with calloused hands and a heart that had grown used to being abandoned. She lost her mother at 14. Her father walked out. She grew up in foster homes where not a single one ever called her family. She wasn't rich, wasn't glamorous, didn't know how to hold a wine glass the way high society expected, but she had something no one in that room possessed: the dignity of a woman who'd lost everything and still chose to stand back up. And him? His name was Beckett Calloway, 33, a faded scar running down his temple, eyes so dark that when he looked at someone long enough, they'd forget how to breathe. The world knew him as the most dangerous man in any room he walked into, but Genevieve knew him as the man who woke at 5 every morning to make her coffee before she'd even opened her eyes. That night, they thought humiliating her was entertainment. They were wrong, and this is the story of the price they paid. Stay with me, you won't forget this one. If you believe dignity's something no one has the right to destroy, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear they're worth more than what others think. And subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Before meeting Beckett, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the Lower East Side hadn't fully awakened yet. The streets were still wet with night mist. A few taxis moved lazily through the intersections, and the tiny antique clock shop wedged between a laundromat and an old bookstore was already lit. Not with a large light, not with the harsh white fluorescent glow of other shops. Just one desk lamp, its pale yellow light falling only far enough across the worn oak work table with 2 rubbed-down corners and the tiny gears lined up on a strip of black velvet. Genevieve sat there, her back straight, both hands resting on the table, and in front of her was a French wall clock from the 1950s that its owner had brought in last week with the note, "If you can't fix it, no one can." She hadn't touched it yet. She was drinking coffee. The old mocha pot on the small gas stove in the corner of the shop was still hot, thin steam rising and then dissolving into the air. She didn't turn on music, didn't turn on the radio. Genevieve's mornings had no soundtrack, no human voices, only the ticking of dozens of clocks hanging around the walls, each one running to a slightly different rhythm, a few fractions of a second apart, creating a symphony whose melody only she could hear. She took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, then began. Her right hand held the smallest flathead screwdriver. Her left hand held the clock face tilted at 45 degrees. She removed the back cover, removed the retaining ring, removed the dial. Each movement was as precise as a surgeon opening a rib cage to find where the heart had slipped out of rhythm. She didn't hurry. She never hurried. Every clock that came into her hands had already been rejected somewhere else, had already been told by someone, "It's beyond saving, throw it away." And she treated them the way she wished someone had once treated her, with patience, with the belief that something that looked dead could still beat again if someone was willing to listen long enough. At 7 o'clock, having finished her early inspection, she walked back to her living quarters upstairs. 4 flights of stairs with no elevator led up to her apartment, and she counted each step the way she did every morning. Not out of habit, but because counting footsteps gave her something to focus on instead of thinking too much. 68 steps. Always 68. She opened the door and stepped inside. The apartment was small, clean to the point of almost being empty. The bed was neatly made, even though she had left it only 10 minutes earlier. There were never more than 2 dishes in the sink. The towel was folded into a square and hung exactly where it belonged. Not because she loved neatness, because when you grew up in too many places that were not your home, you learned that keeping everything tidy was the only way not to be complained about, not to be seen, not to be remembered in a way you didn't want. That habit had followed her all the way to now, even when no one checked her room at midnight anymore, even when this apartment was hers, rented with money she earned herself, locked with a key she held herself. She changed clothes, washed her face, and stood before the small mirror in the bathroom. She didn't look for long. She never looked in the mirror for long. Then, before leaving, she stopped beside the nightstand, opened the drawer. Inside, resting on a piece of velvet just like the one she used in the shop, was a pocket watch. Small, round, with a silver case dulled by time, its glass slightly cloudy but its hands still moving steadily. This watch, Genevieve hadn't repaired for a customer. She had repaired it for herself when she was 10, sitting beside her mother in a small kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and butter, beneath a yellow light just like the desk lamp she now used in the shop. Her mother, Dolores, had sat beside her, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching her struggle to remove the back of the pocket watch with a screwdriver far too large for her tiny hand. Slowly, Viv. Don't force it. Listen. Anything broken can run again, sweetheart. It only needs someone patient enough to find which gear slipped out of place. 13 years had passed. Her mother's voice was still as clear as if she were sitting right beside her. Genevieve lifted the watch, threaded the silver chain through the small ring, and fastened it around her neck. The watch face rested perfectly against the left side of her chest, right where her heart was beating. She hid it beneath her shirt, where no one could see. Then she stepped out the door, locked the apartment at the top of those 68 stairs, and officially opened the shop for the day. But Genevieve didn't live alone anymore. It had been 2 years since she last woke in an empty apartment, with only the ticking of clocks to keep her company. Now, every morning, when she opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed wasn't the old ceiling or the streetlight slipping through thin curtains. It was the smell of coffee. The cup sat on the nightstand, exactly where her hand could reach it, still warm enough to drink right away without waiting for it to cool. Every morning, without missing a single day. Beckett Calloway wasn't the kind of man who said, "I love you" every day. He was the kind of man who made coffee at 5 o'clock in the morning and placed the cup beside his wife's pillow before she even knew he was awake. He was the kind of man who showed affection through gestures so small most people wouldn't notice them. But Genevieve noticed every one, because she had lived too many years without anyone doing anything for her, so when someone did, even if it was only a cup of coffee at the right temperature, she felt it the way she felt the pulse beneath the shell of a watch. Some evenings, Genevieve brought work home, sat at the kitchen table beneath the yellow lamp, opened an antique watch, and began taking it apart layer by layer. Beck sat in the chair across from her, saying nothing, not reading the newspaper, not looking at his phone, just sitting there, both hands on the table, watching her work, watching her hands move among gears as tiny as sesame seeds, watching the way she tilted her head to listen to the trial ticking after she put one piece back in place, watching how she closed her eyes for 2 seconds and opened them again, as if she had just heard the answer from somewhere inside. Once, Genevieve looked up and caught him watching, and she asked, "Why do you keep staring?" Beck didn't laugh, didn't joke, only said very simply, "Because I've never seen anyone talk to objects with her hands and have them listen like that." She remembered laughing, and he laughed with her, the kind of laugh that only happens when there are just 2 people in the room, and no one has to brace themselves. They met because of a watch. More than 2 years earlier, on an autumn afternoon, the shop bell rang and Genevieve looked up to see a man step inside, too tall for the low doorframe, too broad-shouldered for the narrow aisle between the 2 rows of glass display cabinets. He placed a pocket watch on the counter, its silver case tarnished black, the glass cracked at one corner, the hands frozen at 3:17. He said it had belonged to his father, that he had taken it to 3 other places, and all 3 had refused it. One saying it was too old, another saying the movement inside had rotted, another saying finding replacement parts would be harder than finding a needle at the bottom of the sea. Genevieve lifted the watch, opened the back, and looked inside. She was silent for a while. Then she said, "Leave it with me." No promise that she could fix it. No promise at all. Just, "Leave it with me." 3 weeks later, Beck came back. The watch lay on the counter, its hands moving, the ticking small but steady, like the breathing of someone who had just woken from a very long sleep. Beck picked it up, looked at the watch face, then looked at her. He didn't say thank you. He only stood there a little longer than necessary, then paid and left. 2 weeks later, he came back a second time. He brought a wristwatch and said it ran a few minutes slow each day. Genevieve glanced at it and knew immediately that the watch was perfectly normal, that losing a few minutes on a mechanical watch was ordinary and didn't need repair. But she didn't say that. She accepted it and told him to come back the following week. When he came the 3rd time, he didn't bring a watch. He brought 2 cups of coffee, placed one on the counter in front of her, sat down in the chair for waiting customers, and said, "I don't have any broken watches left, but I do have coffee." Genevieve looked at the coffee, looked at him, then drank. That was the first morning in many years that she had coffee with someone other than herself. They didn't fall in love like lightning or like something in the movies. There were no roses, no confession in the rain. There were mornings when Beck stopped by the shop before work, sat for 15 minutes, and didn't say much. There were evenings when he picked her up after closing, walked with her through a few streets, bought pretzels from a street vendor, and ate them on a park bench, while she told him about a Swiss watch from 1920 that she had just bought online. Beck listened, not with fake politeness, but truly listened, asking follow-up questions, remembering. One evening, while they were sitting together, Beck's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Genevieve saw the name Terry appear, and she saw the way he looked at that name, only for a flicker, but his eyes changed, sharper, colder, as if someone had flipped a switch and turned the man eating pretzels beside her into an entirely different version of himself. But he didn't answer. He silenced the phone, slipped it into his pocket, turned to her, and said very normally, "Not more important than morning coffee." Genevieve didn't ask. She knew there was another world outside those mornings in the shop and those evenings on the park bench. She knew because she wasn't stupid. Because she read the papers. Because she saw the way restaurant staff lowered their heads when Beck walked in. Because she saw the way strangers moved aside when he passed on the sidewalk. She knew, and she chose to stay. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because Beck had never brought that world home, had never let it touch her, had never treated her with anything but a gentleness he seemed to reserve for her, and her alone. But there was one thing Genevieve hid carefully, so deeply she thought Beck didn't know. There were nights when she lay beside him, listening to his steady breathing, and wondered when he would realize she didn't belong in his world, realize she was only the clock repair girl from the Lower East Side, with a wardrobe holding nothing but a few old sweaters and one black dress, realize he deserved someone brighter, more dazzling, someone who didn't make the bed every morning out of a childhood reflex of fear. She didn't say it out loud, but Beck knew. He knew because he read her the way she read watches, with patience, by listening to what made no sound. And each time he saw that fear flicker through her eyes, when she turned her face away a little too quickly, when she pulled her hand back one beat too soon, he said nothing. He only made the morning coffee a little earlier the next day, placed the cup a little closer, as if the only way he knew how to say, "You are enough," wasn't with words, but by being there, every day, without missing a single one. The card arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, lying among a pile of mail that included the electric bill and a catalog of watch parts from Switzerland. Thick paper, cream-colored, gold-embossed lettering, the kind of paper you knew cost more than your lunch just by holding it. A charity fundraiser for children, held in the penthouse at the top of a building on the Upper East Side, with a guest list full of names Genevieve had only ever read on the business pages of the newspaper. She turned the card over, turned it back again, then set it down on the kitchen table as if it might disappear on its own if she didn't look at it long enough. She wasn't planning to go. In fact, her first reaction was to shove the card into the drawer with all the things she didn't want to think about, then forget it existed. But that evening, Beck saw it. He picked the card up from the kitchen table while she was washing dishes, skimmed it, then set it down. "You're not going?" Genevieve didn't turn around, her hand still holding the sponge. "It isn't my place. Your place is anywhere you walk into, Viv." She turned off the faucet, wiped her hands on a towel, and turned to look at him. Beck was leaning against the kitchen doorway, his arms folded across his chest, his head slightly tilted, the kind of look that told her he was serious, not joking. "Don't let them think you're afraid of them." She wanted to say she wasn't afraid, that she simply didn't like it, that parties like that weren't meant for people like her, but she didn't say it, because both of them knew that wasn't the whole truth. Beck walked over, placed his hand on her shoulder, and spoke more gently. "I have something to handle that night, but I'll try to come get you as soon as I can. Go. Eat something good, drink free wine, then come home and tell me how ugly their clothes were." She laughed, a short laugh, almost soundless, but enough for Beck to know she had softened. He didn't push. He never pushed. He only opened the door and let her choose whether to step through it or not. And Genevieve chose to step through. That afternoon, she stood in front of her wardrobe. It wasn't large, just one door, pressed wood, the kind bought from a discount home goods store and assembled by hand from instructions. Inside, there wasn't much to choose from. A few sweaters, 2 pairs of jeans, the white shirt she wore when meeting parts suppliers, and the black dress. Only one. She had bought it 2 years earlier during an end-of-season sale at a shop on Houston Street. A simple dress with a round neckline, long sleeves, fabric neither too thin nor too thick. Nothing special except that it fit her as if it had been tailored for her. She had worn it only once, to the wedding of the woman who worked at the bookstore next door. She took the dress out, brushed it lightly, and hung it on the bathroom door so the steam from the shower could soften the creases. Then she put it on, pulled the zipper up the back by herself, reaching behind, struggling a little at the middle. But she was used to doing everything alone, so it wasn't a problem. She smoothed her hair behind her ears, breathed in, breathed out. She looked at herself in the mirror, not to admire herself, but to check quickly, the way she checked a watch after putting it back together, to see whether anything was off, whether anything needed adjusting. No jewelry, no lipstick, no high heels, because she didn't own any except for a pair of black flats with worn toes. She saw herself in the mirror, and she knew, clearly knew, that when she walked into that room, she would be the plainest person there. But instead of stopping at that thought, she did what she always did whenever she faced something bigger than herself. She acted. She took her purse, checked her keys, checked her phone, turned off the kitchen light, turned off the bedroom light. 68 stairs down. She pushed open the building door and stepped out onto the street. The early autumn night air in Manhattan, cool and sharp. The smell of dry leaves mixed with exhaust. She called a taxi, read the address from the card, then sat quietly watching the city drift past the window as the car drove uptown, toward taller buildings, heavier doors, and colder smiles. The private elevator, the kind that only opened with a key card, carried her to the top floor without stopping at any floor in between. The doors opened, and Genevieve stepped into a world she had only ever seen in magazines left in dentists' waiting rooms. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling. Champagne glasses stood arranged on silver trays carried through the room by servers in black suits, and the scent of expensive perfumes blended together into something heavy and thick, something she couldn't name but knew with certainty did not belong to her. She didn't stop at the door. She knew that if she stopped for even 1 second, she would turn around, step back into the elevator, and press the button down. So she walked straight ahead, eyes forward, searching for somewhere to sit. In the right corner of the room, near the wide glass windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, there was a table smaller than the others, with only 4 chairs, and no one sitting there yet. She went to it, sat down, and when a server came over to ask what she wanted to drink, she said, "Water." Not because she didn't drink wine, because she needed her mind clear in a room where every instinct in her body was screaming that this was not safe territory. She sat there, glass of water in her hand, and did what she did best. She observed. She watched the way the women in the room laughed, the kind of laugh that showed just enough white teeth but never grew too loud, because laughing too loudly cost points. She watched the way they touched one another's arms while speaking, light touches that seemed less like friendliness and more like marking territory. She watched the men gather in groups, whiskey glasses in hand, talking about numbers, each number carrying more digits than the money she made in a year. And she saw the way they looked at her. Not all of them, but enough. Quick glances, then turning away. The way people glance at a stain on a tablecloth and pretend not to see it. She was too different. Among silk dresses, sequin dresses, dresses with designer names stitched inside the collar, her simple black dress looked as if it had come from another planet. No one knew who she was, and that was what Genevieve had not expected. She had thought Beckett Calloway's name would be like an invisible shield, that even if she didn't say it aloud, somehow people would still know, would keep their distance, would remain polite. But the truth was that Beck and she lived so quietly that, to the outside world, they were almost invisible together. They didn't attend events, didn't appear in newspapers, didn't post photographs. Beck wanted it that way, and so did she, because both of them preferred a life made for 2 people over a life lived under flashing cameras. But that also meant that tonight, in this room, Genevieve was only an unfamiliar woman in a cheap black dress sitting alone in the corner. No one feared her. No one needed to be polite to her, and just as she realized that, Margot Sinclair entered. She didn't enter the way ordinary people entered a room. She entered, and the room changed. as if someone had turned the brightness up by 1 degree. People turned to look. People set aside the conversations they had not yet finished. People leaned slightly toward her without realizing they were doing it. The kind of woman whose presence carried its own gravity and made everything around her begin to orbit. Margot moved across the room, smiled at the right people, touched the right hands, said the right words. Then her eyes swept toward the corner, reached Genevieve's table, and stopped, only for 1 tick of time. If someone hadn't been paying attention, they wouldn't have noticed. But Genevieve was paying attention, because attention was what she did best, and she clearly saw the moment Margot's eyes recognized her and changed, from indifference to sharp coldness, as quickly as turning a page. Margot knew who she was, not because Genevieve was famous, but because Margot knew Beck, knew him in the way a woman knows a man who had once been inside her orbit before he chose someone else, and that someone else, the woman sitting here in a discounted black dress with a glass of water instead of champagne, was exactly what Margot could not understand, could not accept, and could not forgive. Because if Beck had chosen Genevieve, then it meant Margot, with all her brilliance and beauty, had still not been enough. And nothing is more dangerous than a woman trying to prove she is enough by humiliating the one who was chosen instead of her. The whispering began soon after, not loud, not clear, only glances that lingered a little longer than usual. Heads tilted toward one another. Thin smiles Genevieve could feel, even though she couldn't hear the words. They didn't know she was Beck's wife. They only knew she didn't belong here. And in places like this, not belonging was reason enough. Less than 10 minutes later, Margot came over. Not by accident. Not because she happened to be passing by. She walked straight to Genevieve's table with purposeful steps, followed by 3 women Genevieve guessed were her friends. Or at least the kind of people who always stood near the most powerful person in the room so they could bask in the reflected light. Margot stopped in front of the table, tilted her head, and smiled so widely that anyone watching from a distance would have thought 2 old friends had just found each other again. "Genevieve, you came. I almost didn't recognize you." Her voice was warm, friendly, perfect enough that if someone didn't look into her eyes, they might believe it was sincere. But Genevieve looked into her eyes, and she saw that what hid behind that smile was not joy, but calculation, the eyes of someone choosing the exact place to set the tip of the knife. Genevieve gave a small nod. "Hello, Margot?" That was all. She didn't know what else to say, and she didn't want to say anything else, because she had learned that the less she said, the less people had to use against her. But Margot didn't need her to say much. Margot only needed an audience. She pulled out the chair and sat across from Genevieve, as if this were her table, and the 3 other women immediately stood around them, forming a small circle with Genevieve sitting in the center. "You have to let me say this." Margot leaned back, her eyes moving from top to bottom over Genevieve's black dress, slowly, publicly, without bothering to hide it. "Your dress is so cute, simple but elegant. I have something similar." She stopped, exactly 1 beat, long enough for everyone to wait. "For the maid." Laughter burst from the 3 women standing around her. Not the kind of laughter that comes unexpectedly from a good joke, but the kind already prepared in advance. The kind of laughter from people who knew their role was to laugh at the right time so the person leading them would be pleased. Genevieve remained stoic, showing no outward reaction. On the outside, her face didn't change, but inside, something tightened in her chest. Not sadness, not hurt, anger, hot, sour anger. The kind she knew well. The kind she had spent many years learning to swallow because she had understood since childhood that people without power didn't have the right to be angry. One of the 3 women tilted her head, her voice falsely sweet. "So what do you do, Genevieve? I've never seen you at events like this before." The question wasn't curiosity. It was a trap, and Genevieve knew that, but she had no choice except to answer, because silence now would be understood as weakness even more than any answer would. "I repair antique watches." She spoke evenly, looking straight at the woman who had asked, not lowering her head, not embarrassed. It was her work, and she wasn't ashamed of it. The silence lasted 1 second, 2 seconds, and then Margot broke it with a long, "Oh," the kind of "oh" people use when someone tells them they collect stamps. How cute, like a child's little hobby. This time the whole group laughed louder. They no longer tried to hide it. The laughter rang loud enough that several people at the next table turned to look, and Genevieve saw in their eyes not sympathy but curiosity, the the curiosity of an audience watching a show and feeling glad they weren't the one on stage. Genevieve bit her lip. Not lightly, hard enough to feel the pressure against her skin, hard enough to give the anger somewhere to go that wasn't through her mouth. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say that these childish hands had repaired things the whole world had given up on. She wanted to say that she knew exactly which gear inside the watch Margot was wearing on her wrist was off by 0.5 millimeter, and that the $10,000 watch was running 3 seconds slow every day without Margot knowing it. But she didn't speak, because the anger inside her now wasn't the kind that rose and burned out. It was the deep kind, the kind that dragged her back to a place she thought she had left far behind, where she sat still in the corner of a room and let other people say whatever they wanted, because she had no right to object, because objecting meant drawing attention, and drawing attention had never ended well for her. That feeling, the feeling she thought she had left behind a very long time ago, was coming back, clear and sharp enough that she could almost hear it, like the ticking of a watch someone had deliberately wound too tightly until the spring broke. She set her glass of water down on the table, stood, not quickly, not slowly. "Excuse me, I need to wash my hands for a moment." Her voice was normal, completely normal, so normal that no one in Margot's group realized that beneath that normalness, everything was boiling. She walked away, her back straight, her steps even, past the banquet tables, past the crystal light, past the soft laughter she didn't have to turn around to know was about her. She pushed open the restroom door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. Standing before the sink, both hands braced on the marble countertop, she looked down. She didn't cry. Genevieve didn't cry. She breathed. Deep breaths, slow breaths, the way she breathed while repairing a particularly difficult watch, and needed her hands not to tremble by even one line. She turned on the faucet, splashed cold water onto her face, letting the cold pull her back into the present. Then she turned off the water, dried her face with a paper towel, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes weren't red. Her face wasn't swollen. She looked normal, and normal was enough. She took one last deep breath, threw the paper towel into the trash, then pushed the door open and stepped back out, returning to the room without knowing that in the few minutes she had been gone, someone had touched the chair where she had been sitting. Genevieve stepped out of the restroom, her face still slightly damp at both temples, where the water had not fully dried. She walked through the party room, her eyes fixed straight ahead on her table, not looking to either side, not searching for Margot or anyone in her group. She only wanted to sit down, drink her water, wait for the party to end, and go home. That was all. When she reached the table, she saw someone had left a tall glass of red wine right at the edge, dangerously close to her seat, a deep crimson trap waiting in the quiet. She didn't care much. She pulled out the chair and sat down. For the first 2 seconds, everything was normal. She placed both hands on the table, her fingers touching the edge of the white tablecloth, feeling the smooth fibers beneath her skin. She breathed in, and then she heard it. The sound of wood, not the ordinary creak of an old chair. It was a cracking sound, the sound of something breaking from the inside, slow, clear, like the sound of a fishbone being snapped. For one moment, only one moment, she felt the seat beneath her tilt. Not much, only a few degrees, but enough for her stomach to tighten because instinct understood before her mind did that something was wrong. Then the chair collapsed. Not slowly. It collapsed all at once, all 4 legs seeming to lose their joints at the same time, and Genevieve's body dropped with nothing to hold on to. Her hands grabbed the tablecloth by reflex and pulled it down with her. Everything on the table fell after her onto the floor. A porcelain plate slid over the edge of the table, hit the marble floor, and broke into 3 pieces. The glass of red wine overturned, wine splashing out, soaking into her black dress, the dark red stain spreading slowly across the fabric like a wound opening wider. The small candle on the table rolled down to the floor, its flame flickering near the hem of her dress, and a man sitting at the next table hurriedly bent down and smothered it with a napkin, his face wrinkling more from surprise than concern. Genevieve's back struck the marble floor, cold. The floor was so cold she could feel it pierce through the thin fabric of her dress, seep into her spine, and spread across both shoulders. She lay there, among broken plates, among red wine, among the white tablecloth now stained, and for 1 second, one very long second, the room went silent, completely silent, as if everyone had breathed in at the same time and forgotten to breathe out. Then the laughter came. Not startled laughter. Not the kind of laughter that comes when someone slips on a banana peel. This was different laughter. It started in one corner of the room, small at first, then spread quickly, like fire catching dry grass. The laughter of people who had been waiting for this. Laughter prepared in advance. Laughter already sitting in their throats, waiting only for a signal to burst out. Warren, Margot's husband, spoke from his table in a voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. Someone should check the weight limit of the chairs before inviting strangers. And the room exploded. This time the laughter no longer hid itself. It was loud, comfortable, cruel in the way only a crowd can be cruel. Because when everyone laughs together, no one has to take responsibility. One's laughter disappears inside everyone else's laughter, and all of us are innocent. Margot stood a few steps away. She didn't laugh loudly. She didn't need to. She only stood there, one hand holding a champagne glass at chest level, smiling. A small, discreet smile. The smile of someone who had just placed the final chess piece and knew she had won. Genevieve saw that smile. From the floor, lying among broken plates and red wine, she looked up and met Margot's eyes. And in that moment, she knew clearly, without needing proof, without needing anyone to confirm it. This was not an accident. From the bar, a young server, probably in his early 20s, his face clean-shaven and youthful, set down his tray and ran toward Genevieve. He bent down, held out his hand, his mouth saying, "Ma'am, let me help." But before he could touch her hand, the party manager stepped forward, caught the server by the arm, pulled him back, shook his head slightly, and said in a low voice that was still clear enough to hear, "Don't draw attention. Go back to the bar." The server stood there for 1 second, looking at Genevieve on the floor, looking at the manager, then stepped back, his hand dropping, his face full of something that looked like shame, even though it wasn't his shame to carry. Genevieve lay on the floor. Her hands were shaking. Not from the cold. They were shaking because her whole body was fighting between collapsing completely and holding on to whatever little remained. Her eyes burned, stung sharply, tears rising to the lids, but she would not let them fall. She refused. She bit down hard on her lip, hard enough to taste the faint metallic edge of blood on the tip of her tongue. And that small pain, the pain she had chosen herself, pulled her out of the larger pain that others had forced on her. And then, by reflex, from something deeper than thought, deeper than awareness, something carved into her bones since childhood, she whispered, "I'm sorry." Then again, "I'm sorry. Sorry to the people laughing at her. Sorry because she had knocked over the plates, stained the tablecloth, interrupted their party. Sorry because she had existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sorry because a lifetime of enduring had taught her that when something bad happened, even when it wasn't her fault, the first thing she had to do was apologize, so she wouldn't be noticed any more than she already was." As she lay there, the silver chain around her neck was pulled tight by the fall, and the pocket watch slipped out from beneath her collar. It dropped onto the marble floor with a small ringing sound, much smaller than the sound of the plates breaking, so small that no one heard it through the laughter. The watch rolled a few centimeters away, and a high-heeled shoe stepped over it, crushing the glass face without knowing, or without caring. A small, clean crack. The glass face shattered in the shape of a star, the crack spreading from the center, and the watch hands trembled once, then stopped completely. Genevieve saw it. From the floor, her eyes caught the watch lying less than a handspan from her, its glass cracked, its hands dead, the last keepsake from her mother. The only thing left from a woman who had once told her that anything broken could run again. Now it lay there, on the cold floor, among red wine and broken plates, silent. The laughter was still there, but Genevieve could no longer hear it clearly. It became a dull, warped sound, like someone had turned on a television in the next room, and all she could hear was the muffled hum through the wall. Her head went numb. Not dizzy, not painful. It was the kind of numbness that came when the body decided to shut down certain senses to protect what remained. The way a watch stops its hands when the movement inside is under too much pressure, not because it is broken, but because it is saving itself. She lay on the floor for a few more seconds. Maybe 3 seconds. Maybe 10. She didn't know. Time lost meaning when no one around you cared enough to count it for you. Then she placed both hands on the marble floor. Cold. Her palms touched the wine-wet floor, slick beneath her skin, but she pressed down hard enough to find leverage, One hand, then the other. She pushed herself up. Her knees shook so badly she could feel them knocking together beneath the fabric of her dress. But she didn't stop. She stood. No one helped. Not one hand reached out. The room was full of people, and she got up by herself, the same way she had gotten up by herself every time she had fallen for the past 27 years. She stood straight. Her breathing was shallow and quick, but she could control it. She wiped both hands on her dress, an unconscious motion, and felt the cold, wet red wine soak from the fabric into her palms, sticky and unpleasant. She looked down at her hands, saw the dark red color spreading along the lines of her palms, and for one moment, it didn't look like wine. Then her eyes searched for the watch. It was there, on the floor, less than half a meter from her foot. The glass face was shattered in the shape of a star, the hands dead still, the silver chain curled beside it like a small sleeping snake. She bent down, picked it up, slowly, carefully, the way she picked up an antique watch from a box in her shop, gently, with both hands, as if it were the most fragile thing in the world, and she was the only person who knew how to touch it without breaking it further. She looked at the cracked glass. The minute hand and the hour hand both stood still. The watch had stopped breathing. The last time she had looked at it before leaving home tonight, it had still been running, its small, steady ticking pressed against the left side of her chest through the fabric, warm and alive. Now, it was silent. She closed her hand around the watch, gripping it just tightly enough to feel the edge of the silver case press into her palm. Then she straightened again, and she walked. She did not run. Genevieve did not run. She had never run, because running let people know you were afraid, and she had learned very early that letting people know you were afraid only gave them more reason to chase. She didn't lower her head either, but she didn't raise it. She looked straight ahead, her eyes level with the door on the other side of the room, and she walked, step by step, steady, slow, across the cold marble floor, past the round tables covered in white cloth, past the champagne glasses still half full, past the people looking at her while she did not look back. The laughter behind her grew smaller, not because they stopped laughing, but because she was moving farther away from them with every step, and distance blurred the laughter, turned it into background noise she could push aside if she focused hard enough on the rhythm of her feet. 1 step, 2 steps, 10 steps, 20 steps. She didn't count. She only walked. Her right hand held the dead watch. Her left hand hung at her side, and the wine-soaked dress clung coldly to her thighs with every step. Uncomfortable, but she didn't care. She thought of only one thing. Home. 68 stairs. The old mocha pot. The work table with the yellow lamp. Back to the place where no one laughed at her. Back to somewhere safe. She reached the entrance door. The heavy wooden door, painted dark, with a brass handle. She lifted her left hand. Her fingers touched the handle, and she felt the cold metal beneath her skin. She was about to turn the handle, about to pull the door open, about to step outside, about to end all of this by disappearing into the New York night, the way she had always disappeared from places that didn't belong to her. And then the door opened. From the other side, Beckett Calloway stood on the other side of the door. He was wearing a dark gray suit, no tie, the top button of his white shirt open, the kind of clothing worn by a man who had just left a meeting where he was the one who decided when it ended. He had finished nearly 2 hours earlier than expected. On the way home, he called Genevieve. The first time, the phone rang until it fell into voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He called a second time. It rang through. Voicemail. For most people, 2 missed calls meant nothing. But for Beck, when Genevieve didn't answer, that was the only thing that meant anything. Because Genevieve always answered. Always. Whether she was repairing a watch, whether she was cooking, whether she was sleeping, she answered because she knew Beck didn't call unless he needed to. And Beck knew she knew that. So when the phone rang twice and no one picked up, he didn't call a third time. He said to Terry, the penthouse on the Upper East Side, the charity party. Terry didn't ask why. Terry never asked why. He only drove. And now Beck stood there, his hand still on the handle he had just pushed open. And in front of him was Genevieve. She stood less than 1 step away from him. Her right hand was gripping something small, though he hadn't yet seen clearly what it was. Her black dress was blotched with dark red from waist to thigh, wet, clinging to the fabric. Her hair had fallen slightly to one side, a few strands sticking to her neck. Her eyes were red, the lower lids slightly swollen, but dry. No tears. Beck looked at her. Not with a passing glance. He looked the way he read everything. Quickly. Precisely. Missing no detail. The wine stain on her dress. The red on her left palm. The slight tremor in her knees beneath the fabric. Eyes red, but not crying. And the thing she was holding in her right hand. He looked more closely. The pocket watch. The cracked glass face. The dead hands. He didn't need to ask what had happened. 3 seconds of looking at his wife's face was enough. 3 seconds to read everything the room behind her had done. 3 seconds for his jaw to tighten. Lightly, but enough for the muscle at his temple to twitch once. The faint scar there creasing slightly. Genevieve opened her mouth. "Let's go home, Beck." Her voice was small, rougher than usual. The voice of someone who had swallowed too much in too short a time. She wanted to leave. She wanted to turn her back on this door, step into the elevator, go down to the ground floor, out to the street, into the car, home, and forget everything. The way she had forgotten every other wound before, stuffing it into a drawer inside her mind and locking it, pretending it didn't exist. Beck didn't answer right away. He looked at her for one more second. Then he reached out and took her left hand. The hand still stained with red wine, holding it gently but firmly. The kind of hold that didn't need to tighten for her to understand that he wasn't going anywhere, and instead of leading her outside, he led her back into the party room. Genevieve felt the slight pull of his hand and understood immediately what he wanted. Not revenge. She knew Beck wasn't the kind of man who took revenge at a party. He was the kind of man who took revenge by making people never forget, and the way he did that wasn't with fists, but with presence. He wanted her to return because he would not accept her leaving like this. Not leaving in a dress stained with wine and with trembling hands. Not leaving when their laughter was the last thing she heard. Not leaving like someone defeated. She let him lead her. The two of them walked back into the party room together, hand in hand, and the room began to change before they had taken 5 steps. Not because of conscience, but because someone recognized the man who had just entered. Genevieve didn't know who recognized him first. Maybe the man standing near the door. Maybe one of the servers. Maybe someone who had once seen Beck's photograph in a newspaper or in a file ordinary people were never supposed to see. But she felt the moment his name began to spread. It was like a ripple, different from the cruel whispering before. This murmur carried a different vibration, a thread of panic woven through it. Beckett Calloway. From one table to another, from one group to the next, fast as flame running along a fuse, and every candle in the room seemed to flicker at once. The laughter died, not gradually. It died as if someone had pulled the plug. 1 second. There was noise. The next second, complete silence. And in that silence, Beck led Genevieve across the room. His steps even, slow, unhurried. The steps of a man who knew he did not need to rush, because no one dared stand in his way. He brought her back to the table where she had been sitting, where the broken chair still lay on the floor among shattered plates and a dirty tablecloth. He pulled a chair from the table beside it and placed it in front of her. Genevieve sat down, then Beck bent. In a room so quiet that the melting ice in someone's glass could be heard, he went down on one knee and picked up a small piece of glass. A piece of the watch glass. It lay on the marble floor near the spot where the pocket watch had been stepped on. A small triangular shard, clear and sharp-edged. He picked it up with 2 fingers, carefully, then stood, slipped the glass into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, on the left side, over his heart. He said nothing about that piece of glass, offered no explanation, didn't look at it again. He simply put it away as if it were something he was meant to keep, because it belonged to something important to the woman he loved, and anything important to her was important to him. Then he straightened, turned, faced the room, and now no one was laughing, no one was whispering, no one dared look directly into those black eyes. The eyes now sweeping slowly across every table, every face, every person in that room. The eyes the world knew meant that if they rested on someone for too long, that person should begin to worry. The room was silent like a tomb with its lid open. Not the kind of silence that came because people had run out of things to say, but because everyone was holding their breath. The kind of silence so heavy you could feel its weight pressing down on shoulders, chests, and throats. Dozens of people inside the most luxurious penthouse in Manhattan, each one used to being the most important person in the room, now sat or stood like wax figures dressed in designer clothes, holding champagne glasses whose bubbles had gone flat. Beck didn't hurry. He stood beside Genevieve's table, his hands at his sides, and looked. Not a general look, not the kind people use when sweeping their eyes over a crowd. He looked at each person, each table, each face. He began with the closest table, where two middle-aged men were pretending to be very busy with their whiskey glasses. He looked at them long enough for them to feel that gaze on their skin. Then he moved to the next table, where three women were staring down at their plates, as if their salads had suddenly become deeply fascinating. He looked at each one, slowly, evenly, with the assessment of a man used to judging who could be trusted and who couldn't in a room with only his eyes. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, not loud at all. If an ambulance had passed outside, it might have drowned him out. But in the silence pressing down on this room, Beck's voice carried every syllable clearly, low, even, neither rising nor falling, the voice of a man who didn't need to shout, because he had never had to shout to be heard. I stood at that door long enough. He stopped. Not because he needed to think of the next sentence, but because he knew the silence between sentences was more frightening than the words themselves. I saw who laughed. A pause. I saw who turned away. A pause. And I saw that not one person in this room reached out a hand to help my wife stand up. The last sentence wasn't louder than the others, but it was heavier. It settled in the middle of the room like a stone dropping onto the surface of still water, and the ripples from it spread everywhere, touching every person, every table, every corner. No one looked at him. The man holding the whiskey glass set it down on the table very carefully, as if afraid the sound of glass touching wood would make Beck turn toward him. The woman in the turquoise dress at the third table near the window was twisting her napkin in her hands, twisting it open and closed, her fingers trembling slightly. A young man in the corner swallowed loudly enough for the person beside him to hear. Then Warren spoke. From his table, about 4 tables away from Beck, Warren Holt sat up straight, forcing out a smile he was surely convinced looked relaxed, but that looked more like a grimace, and said, his voice a little higher than usual, "Come now. It was merely an accident. Old furniture is prone to wear. There is no need to make such a scene." Beck turned and looked at Warren. Only looked. Didn't speak. Didn't step forward. Didn't raise a hand. Only looked. And under that gaze, Warren went silent in the middle of his sentence, the smile frozen dead on his mouth, his right hand holding his glass with a tremor light enough to send small ripples across the surface of the drink. Warren looked away first. He lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the table, and said nothing more, as if someone had just pulled all the air from his lungs. Beck left Warren sitting there with his own silence. Then he did something no one expected. He stepped over to the broken chair still lying on the floor, among the shattered plate and the stained tablecloth. He bent down and picked it up, with one hand, gently, as if picking up something discarded that he believed deserved a closer look. The broken chair, its legs bent crooked, its seat uneven, its screws loose. He carried it to the center of the room, set it down, right in the main aisle, where everyone could see. The chair sat there like evidence in a trial where no one wanted to be a witness. Beck stood beside it, looked down at the chair for a moment, then raised his eyes and looked around the room again. "This is the chair my wife sat in." His voice remained even, still low, still neither rising nor falling. Would anyone like to explain why it broke? The question hung suspended in the middle of the room. No one answered. No one even breathed hard. The man who had said someone should check the chairs before inviting strangers was now staring down at his polished leather shoes, staring so intently it was as if he were counting every stitch across the toe. And if someone had asked him his own name just then, he might not have remembered it. A woman at the table on the left quietly pushed her chair a few centimeters farther back, as if physical distance could separate her from what had happened. Another person set a champagne glass down on the table, gently, then folded both hands together on her lap, hiding them away, as if her hands were guilty too because they had held a glass of wine while someone lay on the floor. Beck said nothing more. He didn't need to. He had placed the broken chair in the middle of the room, between the crystal chandelier and the silver champagne trays. And that contrast was its own verdict. A broken chair inside luxury, a cruelty inside smiles, a woman lying on the floor in a room full of people where no one offered a hand. Beck stood there, silent, and his silence filled the room heavier than any speech could have. Because there are people who, when they speak, can be argued with, but when they are silent, no one knows where to place an argument, and Beckett Calloway was silent. in the middle of the room, beside the broken chair, with eyes moving from table to table, person to person, and every person his gaze passed over felt as though a file had just been opened, read, and placed into a drawer marked noted. Margot stood on the other side of the room, her champagne glass still in her hand, but the victorious smile from earlier had disappeared. In its place was something else, not quite fear, not yet fear, but the realization that the game she had believed she was winning had just changed its rules in the middle of the round, and the man who changed the rules was standing 10 steps away from her, silent, waiting. The silence stretched another 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and Margot Sinclair couldn't bear it. She wasn't the kind of person who stood still while someone else took the stage, especially in a room where she was used to being the center. To Margot, silence wasn't peace. It was loss of control. And Margot Sinclair did not lose control. Never. She set her champagne glass down on the nearest table. Slowly, the sound of glass touching wood ringing softly through the room, quiet as a page being torn. Then she stood, back straight, chin slightly lifted, shoulders open. The posture of someone used to facing boardrooms, full of powerful men, and never being the one to lower her head first. She stepped away from the group of women who had followed her all evening, walked toward Beck, not quickly, not slowly, exactly on rhythm, and stopped about 4 steps from him, close enough to speak directly, far enough not to be seen as a physical challenge. "You're overreacting, Beck." Her voice was calm, even faintly weary, the voice of someone trying to create the impression that all of this was boring and not worth anyone's time. "This is a party, not a trial. People fall out of chairs every day. Old chairs, new chairs. No one checks the legs before sitting down. It was an accident, and you're turning it into a drama no one here wants to watch." She looked around the room as she said the last sentence, searching for agreement, looking for nods, for eyes that would side with her. But no one nodded. No one looked back at her. The allies who had laughed with her 15 minutes earlier were now studying their fingernails or pretending to search for something inside their purses. Beck did not react right away. He let Margot's sentence hang in the air for a few more seconds, let it reveal its own emptiness, then turned to look at her. And he said one word. Margot. Just that. Her name. But the way he said it, slowly, each syllable separated, as though spelling out the name of someone he knew very well and had stayed silent about for a very long time, made Margot stop in the middle of a breath, not because she was afraid. Margot wasn't afraid yet, but because she heard something in the way Beck said her name that she did not want to hear. Certainty. He knew. "I know exactly what happened," Beck said, his voice still low, still even, but now every word carried more weight, like stones being placed one by one on a scale. "And this whole room knows too." His eyes swept over the faces looking down. "The only difference is that I'm not afraid to say it." Margot swallowed. Quickly, almost invisibly, but Genevieve saw it, because Genevieve was watching her from the new chair. And when you are used to observing which gear sits out of place inside a watch, you also see the moment someone slips out of rhythm inside herself. Margot lost control for exactly 1 tick of time. Only 1 tick. Her pupils widened a little, her jaw tightened a little, her thumb pressed against her index finger a little. Then she took herself back, fast, professionally, because Margot was not an amateur. She knew she couldn't confront Beck directly. No one won against Beck by standing in front of him and arguing, so she did what people like her always did when cornered. She changed targets. She no longer looked at Beck. She turned to Genevieve, and when she spoke, her voice changed. No longer weary or pretending boredom. Her voice was now sweet, slow, precise, like a needle finding the right vein. Maybe the problem wasn't the chair, Beck. She spoke with her eyes still fixed on Genevieve. Maybe if she knew how to dress properly when coming to places like this, knew how to speak properly to the people around her, knew how to. She stopped, tilted her head, and gave a thin smile. "Deserve you." Then people wouldn't have laughed. The whole room breathed in, all at once, like a single body punched in the stomach, because even the cruelest people in that room understood that Margot had just crossed a line, the kind of line that, once crossed, could not be stepped back over. Genevieve sat in the chair, and that sentence came at her like an arrow. Not an arrow that missed or went wide. A precise arrow. It struck the exact place that hurt most, the place Genevieve had stabbed herself thousands of times before, with her own thoughts. Deserve. That word. The word she had asked herself so many nights while lying beside Beck. Did she deserve him? This life? Anything good she had? She heard that word from Margot's mouth, and it struck harder than the fall, harder than the laughter, harder than the broken plates and the red wine soaking her dress, because it did not come from outside. It came from inside. It was what she had told herself every day, and now someone had said it aloud in the middle of the room, in front of her husband, in front of dozens of strangers, and it became so real she almost believed it. Almost, but not quite, because something else happened in that moment. When Margot's sentence rang out, and its echo still hovered in the air, Genevieve realized something she had never realized before. When she said those words to herself, they sounded like truth, painful, but truth. But when she heard them from Margot's mouth, from the mouth of a woman standing there with the sole purpose of humiliating her in front of her husband and everyone else, they sounded different. They no longer sounded like truth. They sounded like a weapon, and a weapon is not truth. A weapon is something people make to cause harm, and it only works when the victim believes it has the right to kill them. Genevieve looked at Margot, looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time that night, there was no fear left in Genevieve's eyes. No numbness, no reflexive "I'm sorry" from a lifetime of enduring. In its place was something else. Something waking up. The whole room waited. Margot waited. The women standing behind Margot waited. Warren waited from his table with his eyes fixed on the tabletop, but his ears lifted. Dozens of strangers holding champagne glasses gone flat waited. They were all waiting for Genevieve to collapse, because that was the most reasonable script, wasn't it? The quiet woman, the woman who had fallen, the woman in the discounted black dress who didn't know how to hold a wine glass the right way. She would lower her head, swallow her tears, let her husband handle everything, then leave in silence. That was what everyone expected. That was what Margot had bet on. Beck turned toward Genevieve. Not quickly, not suddenly. He only shifted his body slightly, from facing Margot to facing his wife, and in that movement there was a change only Genevieve recognized. His face softened. Not much. Just enough for the line of his jaw to loosen. Enough for those black eyes to hold another layer of light, the one he kept for her and her alone. He did not stand in front of her, did not shield her, did not grip her shoulders and say, "Let me handle this." He took her hand. His large, scarred hand held her smaller one, the hand calloused from watch gears and still stained with dried red wine. He squeezed gently. Once, then he said, his voice low enough to feel intimate but clear enough for the entire room to hear, because Beck knew how to control his voice the way he controlled everything else in his life. "You don't need me to speak for you. You have your own voice." Then he stepped back, half a step, only half a step, the length of 1 foot. A distance so small most people in the room did not notice it, but Genevieve noticed. She felt his hand leave hers, felt the warmth depart, felt the tiny space between his shoulder and hers open by a few centimeters, and she understood. He was not leaving her. He was giving her room. He stepped back, so she would have space to step forward. He gave her the stage. Beckett Calloway, the man all New York lowered its voice to name, had just stepped back half a step so his wife, the watch repair woman from the Lower East Side, could have a place to stand. Genevieve sat there. 1 second, 2 seconds. She looked down at her hands resting on her lap. Calloused hands. Dried red wine turned brown in the lines of her palms. Nails cut short because her work demanded precision. A few small scratches only someone in her trade would have. Hands that had repaired hundreds of watches other people had called beyond saving. Hands that had cooked for herself since she was 14. Hands that had opened her shop by themselves, paid her own rent, built a life from nothing. Hands that, 10 minutes earlier, had been trembling on the marble floor. Now they were not trembling anymore. Genevieve breathed in, deeply. The breath passed through her nose, down into her chest, down into her stomach, touched the bottom, then rose back up. She breathed out, slowly. Then she stood, not rushed, not hesitant. The chair moved back behind her with a soft scrape across the marble floor, and that small sound rang through the room like the strike of a gavel opening a trial. She stood straight, shoulders open, eyes open, and for the first time in 27 years, Genevieve Ashford did not choose silence. The first sentence trembled. Genevieve opened her mouth, and her voice shook, only slightly, like a violin string plucked a little too hard, quivering for a moment before finding the right frequency. But she did not stop. She did not allow that trembling to win. She swallowed it down, pressed it back, and kept speaking. "You think because I was silent, I didn't hear?" She looked straight at Margot, not down, not toward Beck, not at anyone else in the room. Only Margot. "I heard everything." Her voice grew a little stronger with the second sentence, like a watch whose spring had just been released. The hands beginning to move, slowly, gradually, but moving. Every whisper from the moment I walked into this room. Every laugh behind my back that you all thought I couldn't hear. Every glance when I sat down at the table. The kind of glance you give something stuck to the bottom of your shoe. She stopped, breathed in, not because she had run out of words, but because each sentence that followed needed space to land. "I heard everything, and I chose not to answer. Not because I'm weak, not because I'm afraid, but because I thought kindness deserved to be tried first. Because I've lived long enough to know that shouting in someone's face doesn't change anything, and sometimes silence is the last form of respect you give someone before you realize they don't deserve it." She stopped again. Longer this time, long enough for the whole room to feel the weight of the space between two spoken thoughts. "But today, you used up every bit of kindness I had for you." That sentence fell into the room like a door slamming shut. Not loud, not noisy, but everyone heard it, and everyone knew that after that closing sound, it would not open again. Genevieve rose from the chair. She walked toward Margot. Not fast, not aggressive, no raised hand, no squared shoulders, no clenched fist. She only walked, each step even and calm. The kind of step belonging to someone who no longer needed to run toward anything, and no longer had anything to run from. She stopped 2 steps away from Margot, close enough to see the foundation on Margot's face cracking slightly at the corner of her eyes, close enough to see the pulse in her throat beating faster than usual, close enough to speak without raising her voice. "You asked whether I deserve this." Genevieve repeated Margot's question, but when the word deserve passed through her mouth, it sounded completely different. It was no longer a weapon. It became a real question, and Genevieve had the answer. "Let me tell you what deserve means to me." She spoke with a calm so steady, it was more frightening than any shout. The kind of calm of a lake whose surface is perfectly still, while beneath it runs a current strong enough to pull everything to the bottom. It means growing up with nothing. No home, no room of my own, no one opening the door at night and saying, "Come home, sweetheart." She did not give details, did not name names, did not name places, did not turn her past into a tragic performance to draw tears. She only told the truth, short, clean, and let the truth carry its own weight. It means being 14 and teaching myself a trade, because no one ever taught me anything except how not to be a burden. Margot stood there, her eyes still on Genevieve, but the thin smile was gone. Not because she felt guilty. Margot wasn't the kind of person who felt guilt easily, but because she realized she was losing control of the conversation, and for Margot, losing control was worse than losing face. It means feeding myself, paying my own rent, opening my shop by myself every morning at 6 o'clock, while the rest of the city is still asleep, building a life from nothing with these 2 hands. She lifted her hands, not high, not as if making a declaration, only forward, level with her chest, palms turned down, letting the whole room see them, the calluses at the tips of her thumbs and forefingers, where tweezers and screwdrivers had pressed every day through thousands of hours of work, the small scratch on the back of her right hand, where the sharp edge of a watch case had cut her last week, and the red wine still dried into the lines of her palms, dark now, like a map of a night she would never forget. "These hands," she said, her voice no longer trembling, flat and solid as the oak work table in the clock shop where she worked every day, "repair the things the whole world says should be thrown away. These hands have fed me since there was no one left to feed me. These hands have never taken anything from anyone that I didn't earn myself." She lowered her hands, looked straight into Margot's eyes. "So you want to ask whether I deserve it? Whether I deserve to stand here? Whether I deserve to sit in this room? Whether I deserve the man standing behind me?" She tilted her head slightly, a small movement, but something changed inside that movement. Not that she became cruel, but that she became clear, sharp, as if a lens had just been adjusted into perfect focus, and everything suddenly appeared undeniable. "I built my life with these hands. I don't borrow anyone's name. I don't stand behind anyone else to feel taller. I don't need an entire room to laugh with me in order to believe I have value." She let the last sentence hang in the air, and in the silence that followed, everyone understood exactly whom she was talking about. Then Genevieve turned to look at the entire room. Not Margot anymore. Everyone. Every table. Every face. Every person who had laughed, who had clapped, who had turned away, who had pretended not to see when she was lying on the floor. She looked at them the way they had looked at her all night, directly, without embarrassment, without asking permission, and for the first time, she saw them lower their eyes before her. These hands. She spoke evenly, neither rising nor falling, the same voice she used when explaining to a customer why a watch had stopped running. Calm, precise, not wasting one word. The hands you laughed at when you learned they repair watches. The hands you called a child's hobby. Her eyes moved over the man who had clapped when she fell. He was looking down at his leather shoes, motionless, as if hoping she would pass him by if he stayed still enough. She did not pass him by. She looked at him long enough for him to feel it, then continued, "These hands have never broken a chair someone was sitting in." That sentence fell into the room, and no one could pick it up. Never covertly swapped a broken chair for someone to fall to the floor in a room full of people, then called it a joke. She turned toward Warren's table, not looking directly at him, but angling her face that way just enough for everyone to know whom she meant. Never pushed someone down just to feel taller. Never clapped while someone lay on a cold stone floor, and not one hand reached out. The room was so silent that the sound of ice melting in someone's whiskey glass could be heard. Tiny drops, small and lonely inside the heavy quiet. A woman at the table near the window gently set her fork down on her plate, as softly as possible. But the sound of metal touching porcelain still rang out, and she startled at the sound she herself had made, as if afraid of being noticed, afraid of being seen, afraid of being placed on the list of those who had laughed. Genevieve turned back to Margot, stepped closer, close enough to smell Margot's perfume, roses mixed with sandalwood, expensive, heavy, the kind of scent that clung to other people's clothes when someone stood too close. She looked into Margot's eyes, and she saw something she couldn't have seen 15 minutes earlier, because back then, she had been looking up from the floor. Now she stood at eye level, and she saw clearly, behind the perfect foundation, behind the sharply made-up eyes, behind the expensive dress and the string of pearls at her throat, Margot Sinclair was trembling. Not in her hands, not in her shoulders, in her eyes, that tiny tremor in the lower lid, the kind of tremor only someone used to reading small details could recognize. And Genevieve was the person most used to reading small details in the world. "You have everything I don't." Genevieve's voice no longer trembled, no longer wavered, steady and even as the ticking of a watch adjusted back to its proper rhythm. Money, a name, connections, an entire room of people ready to laugh with you whenever you want. She paused for one beat, but you still had to break someone else's chair to feel like you were standing steady. Margot inhaled, quickly, sharply, as if she had been slapped with air. The women behind her had already stepped back at some point. No one had noticed when, but the distance between them and Margot was now at least 3 steps wider than before. No one wanted to stand close to her anymore. No one wanted to be connected. Genevieve stopped. 1 beat, 2 beats. She let the silence work for her, because she had learned from Beck that sometimes the empty space between sentences was stronger than the sentence itself. Then she tilted her head slightly to one side, looked at Margot, and asked, "So between you and me, which one of us is the one who can't stand on her own 2 feet?" The question wasn't loud, wasn't shouted, wasn't emphasized. It was light as the sound of a watch hand moving past one mark, but it cut deeper than any shout, because people forget shouting, but the right question stays with them until they find the answer. And the answer to this question, everyone in the room knew, but no one dared say aloud. Margot opened her mouth. Her lips parted, her jaw moved, her tongue touched the roof of her mouth, ready for a syllable. But no word came out, not because she was interrupted, not because Beck threatened her, but because for the first time that night, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, Margot Sinclair could not find anything to say. Every weapon she had, sarcasm, contempt, the crowd's complicit laughter, all of it had been taken from her, and she stood there, mouth open, wordless, like a watch beautiful on the outside but unwound inside, its hands turning with no strength left to move one more step. Absolute silence covered the room. No loud breathing, no clink of glass, no whispering, only the sound of ice melting in a whiskey glass somewhere far away, drip by drip, small and steady, like a countdown for something that had just ended and would never return. Fran at the center table swallowed, the sound clear in the silence, and he quickly lifted his hand to cover his mouth as if his own body had just betrayed him. A woman in a pale yellow dress at the table on the left closed her eyes, not because she was tired, but in the way a person closes her eyes when she doesn't want to see herself in the mirror someone has just placed before the entire room. And Genevieve stood there, in a penthouse at the top of Manhattan, in a black dress stained with red wine, with calloused hands and a cracked watch in her pocket, standing straight, and no one, not one person in that room full of money and power, dared look directly into her eyes. Margot opened her mouth again. This time words came out, but they broke the moment they touched the air. This was only. The sentence hung unfinished, like a bridge built halfway, and then abandoned, because the builder realized there was nothing on the other side to reach. She was searching for words, searching for a way to turn it around, searching for a joke, a denial, something sharp enough to cut through the silence that was choking her. But there was nothing, because the laughter had gone out, and Margot Sinclair had never had to fight without laughter as her weapon. She looked to the right. The woman in the silver dress who had laughed the loudest earlier was now looking down at her phone, her finger sliding across the screen with no purpose, pretending to be busy, pretending she wasn't here, pretending she had never stood beside Margot, and laughed while Genevieve lay on the floor. Margot looked to the left. The other two women had stepped back 2 more paces at some point, and the distance between them and Margot was now wide enough for anyone to understand. They were no longer standing with Margot. They had stood near Margot by accident, and now they were correcting that mistake by moving as far away as possible without running. Margot looked around the room for allies and found no one. Not one pair of eyes looked back. Not one nod. Not one complicit smile. The room that had circled her 15 minutes earlier like planets orbiting the sun had now scattered, leaving her standing alone in the empty space, in her expensive red dress, with eyes beginning to understand that power borrowed from a crowd leaves with the crowd when the crowd turns away. And then Warren stood. The sound of Warren's chair scraping back across the stone floor made a faint screech, and every eye in the room turned toward him. Warren Holt, Margot's husband, the man who had sat silent since the moment Beck walked in, head lowered, eyes fixed on the table, invisible on purpose. He stood, and Margot saw her husband, and in that moment, her eyes lit with a small flash, only a reflex. Because after all, Warren was her husband. After all, he had to stand on her side. After all, he had to say something to defend her, to soften it, to pull her out of the mud. Didn't he? Warren cleared his throat. His eyes did not look at Margot. His eyes looked at Beck, then down at the floor, then to the side. The eyes of an animal searching for a way out of a trap without caring who had to die for it to live. Then he spoke. It was her idea. His hand pointed straight at Margot, his index finger stretched out, his arm almost straight, the movement decisive, like someone pointing at the defendant in court. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't know. If the room had been silent before, now it died. Completely died. This silence was heavier than all the silences before it combined, because it carried the smell of betrayal, and everyone could smell betrayal even when no one wanted to. Margot turned to look at her husband, slowly, very slowly, the kind of turn made by someone who has heard something behind her but cannot believe it is real, so she turns to confirm it, to let her own eyes tell her own mind whether what she has just heard is actually happening. And her eyes confirmed it. Warren was pointing at her. Warren, the man who had sat 2 tables away, who had seen her pass by Genevieve's chair, who knew exactly what she had done and had not said one word to stop it, that Warren was now standing here, pointing at her, saying, "I didn't know," with the pale face of someone ready to throw anyone into the water as long as he stayed dry. Margot's face changed then, and Genevieve saw that change as clearly as watching the hand of a clock jump past the number 12. It was the same, exactly the same as Genevieve's own face when she had been lying on the floor an hour earlier. Shock, betrayal, disbelief, the feeling of the person closest to you, the person who should have stood beside you, pushing you out into the crowd and stepping back. Genevieve recognized the symmetry. Margot had forced her to taste public humiliation. And now Margot was tasting that exact thing. Not from Genevieve, not from Beck, but from the person she had trusted most. Justice did not come through fists or shouting. It came by everything turning itself back into the right position, like gears inside a watch. When one gear slips out of place, Sooner or later, the whole movement stops. Margot stood there. Her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. Because Margot was also the kind of person who did not cry in front of the world. Though not from strength like Genevieve, but from pride. And right now, pride was the only thing she had left to hold. Beck looked at Margot. One last time. There was no anger in his eyes, no satisfaction, no contempt. Only the calm of a man who had seen too much in life to be surprised by anything anymore. He spoke, his voice low and even, as if speaking to the air itself more than to her. Regret is louder than any laughter. You'll understand that soon. Then he turned away. He did not wait for a reply, did not give her one more second of his attention. And that was the heaviest punishment Beckett Calloway gave Margot Sinclair. Not a threat, not revenge, but indifference, being left behind, in the middle of the room where, only a few minutes earlier, she had been queen. Now no one stood beside her. Her husband had betrayed her. Her friends had turned away. The crowd had scattered, and Margot Sinclair stood alone in the penthouse at the top of Manhattan, in the most expensive red dress in the room, her hands holding nothing but a champagne glass gone cold that she had forgotten to set down long ago. Alone, completely alone. And for someone who had lived her whole life on the eyes of others, there was no punishment heavier than that. Beck placed his hand on Genevieve's back, lightly, not the kind of touch that pushed, not the kind that led, but the kind of touch from someone who wanted to say, "I'm here," without opening his mouth. His palm was warm, steady, resting perfectly between her shoulder blades, and Genevieve felt that warmth through the wine-soaked fabric of her dress, seeping into her skin, into her bones, into the place that had been freezing for hours because no one had touched it. The two of them walked toward the door, and Genevieve did not hurry. For the first time that night, perhaps for the first time in many years, she did not want to escape. She did not want to disappear, did not want to shrink, did not want to leave in a way that made no one remember she had ever been there. She wanted to walk, and she wanted them to watch her walk. So she walked slowly, each step even, measured, her back straight, her head not lowered, her eyes on the door but in no rush. The steps of someone who knew the door would wait for her, not someone who had to run toward it. The crowd parted on both sides. No one told them to move aside. No one signaled. No one said, "Make way." They moved on instinct, the way water separates when something passes through. Men pushed their chairs back. Women leaned aside. Someone stepped fully out of the path. Not one word, not one whisper. Only the sound of Genevieve and Beck's footsteps on the marble floor. Steady, slow, echoing softly through the room. Silent now like a church, after the final prayer. Near the door, Genevieve saw him. The young server. The only one who had run to her when she was on the floor. The only one who had reached out his hand before the manager pulled him back. He stood beside the door, slightly off to one side, as if trying not to block the way but also not wanting to stand too far away. In his hand was a glass of water. Plain water. Clear. No champagne, no wine, nothing dazzling. Just water. He held it out toward Genevieve without saying anything, his eyes lifting to her and then dropping. The look of someone who wanted to help but did not know whether he had the right to help. The look Genevieve understood better than anyone, because she had looked at the world through those eyes for 27 years. She took the glass of water, drank one sip. The water was cold, clean, scentless, tasteless. But in that moment, it was better than any champagne in the room. She nodded to the young server, lightly, without a word, but it was enough. In the middle of a night full of cruelty, among a crowd that had laughed when she fell and gone silent when she stood, a glass of plain water from the hand of a young server whose name no one knew was the only truly beautiful thing. Kindness does not need to be grand. It only needs to be real. Beck pushed the heavy door open. The hallway outside was cooler, the light softer, and the air no longer carried the blended perfume of dozens of people. They stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, and the penthouse disappeared behind steel. Ground floor. Lobby doors. Outside, the black car was already waiting beneath the awning. Terry stood beside the car door, holding it open. When Genevieve approached, Terry nodded. Not a polite nod, not the kind of nod a driver gives to the boss's wife. This was different. Slower, deeper, the kind of nod a man gives to someone he respects. And Terry, the former boxer who had walked through places most people only ever saw in movies, did not respect many people. Genevieve stepped into the car. sat down on the leather seat. The car door closed, and she breathed in deeply, truly deeply, for the first time in hours, breathing until her lungs were full, until her chest expanded all the way, until she felt the air reach the hidden corners. Humiliation had sealed shut all night. Then she breathed out, slowly, long, as if releasing something heavier than air. The car began to move. Manhattan fell away behind them. Inside the car, there was silence. Not the heavy silence of the penthouse, not the tense silence of waiting for someone to explode. It was the silence of two people who did not need to fill the space between them with words, because that space was already full of something not every married couple has, an understanding that needs no translation. Streetlights passed over the car windows, yellow streaks sliding across Beck's face and then slipping away. Light and dark, and Genevieve sat beside him, her back against the leather seat, her eyes looking out at the street but seeing nothing, because her mind was somewhere else, replaying every frame of tonight slowly, piece by piece, like rewinding a film in which she had been both the audience and the main actress. Beck spoke first. His voice was softer than usual, stripped of the sharp edge he had used in the penthouse, returning to the voice only Genevieve heard, the voice of mornings with coffee, the voice of evenings sitting across from her while she repaired watches. "I should have come sooner." Not an apology. Beck wasn't the kind of man who said the word sorry easily, but that sentence carried the weight of an apology, and Genevieve heard it, heard the space between should have and come, heard the way he said it as though he had been blaming himself ever since he saw the wine stain on her dress. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were still a little red, her lower lids still slightly swollen, but dry. She looked at him, looked straight at him, and said, "You came at the right time, but I was the one who stood up." The sentence was short, 11 words, but it was the most important sentence Genevieve said that night, more important than the speech she had given in front of Margot, more important than the question, which one of us is the one who can't stand on her own 2 feet, because those sentences had been spoken for others to hear. This one she said for herself, and for Beck, so he would know that she knew. She knew where the strength tonight had come from, not from him walking in, not from the name Beckett Calloway making the whole room fall silent, but from the moment she placed both hands on the cold stone floor and pushed herself back up, when no one helped, when no one looked, when the laughter was still ringing and she was the smallest thing in that room. She had found her own footing before Beck came, before the door opened, before anyone gave her a reason to be strong. Beck looked at her, and he smiled. Not the social smile he used when dealing with the outside world, not the cold half-smile people attached to him in stories told behind his back, but a real smile, rare, light. Only one corner of his mouth lifting slightly, enough for the faint scar at his temple to soften, making him look less frightening, almost gentle. A smile only Genevieve ever got to see. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The car stopped in front of the old building on the Lower East Side. 68 stairs. Beck walked up behind her, not passing ahead, not walking beside her, only behind her, steady step for steady step. And Genevieve counted silently in her mind, out of habit. 68, no more, no less, everything still in its place. Inside the apartment, she changed out of the black dress stained with wine, rolled it up, and placed it in the corner of the laundry area, not throwing it away, because she did not throw things away easily. She never had, a habit belonging to someone who had once never had enough things to throw away. She washed her face, cold water running over her skin, carrying away the exhaustion clinging to her forehead and cheekbones. She put on her old sleep shirt, loose, soft, familiar. Then she did not go to bed. She walked straight to the work table, turned on the desk lamp. The small yellow light fell across the oak table worn at 2 corners, across the black velvet cloth, across the watch repair tools lined up neatly in their places. Familiar light, familiar space, her world. She sat down, took the pocket watch from the pocket of the coat she had removed, and placed it on the velvet. Its glass face was cracked like a star, its hands dead in the same position, its tarnished silver case carrying one new scratch from the fall. She looked at it beneath the yellow light. Then she began. Her right hand held the smallest screwdriver. Her left hand held the watch at an angle. She removed the back cover, removed the retaining ring, removed the cracked glass face, gently, piece by piece, careful not to let any broken shard fall into the movement inside. She checked the gears, checked the spring, checked the axle, cleaned each tiny part with a soft cloth. Slowly, patiently, the way she did every day in the shop. The way her mother had taught her in the kitchen that smelled of cinnamon, the way she had always treated broken things, with the belief that they deserved to be repaired. Beck entered the room. He said nothing. He pulled the chair from the corner, placed it across from the work table, and sat down, watching her, like every other evening, like the way he always sat and watched her repair watches. Silent, patient, as if watching someone do something sacred. But tonight, there was something different. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and took out the small shard of glass, the triangular piece of watch glass. Clear, sharp, edged, the shard he had picked up from the penthouse floor, the shard he had carried in the left pocket of his jacket all night, beside his heart. He put on cuppa, laid it on the table, beside the opened watch, gently, without saying a word. The final broken piece had come back to where it belonged. Genevieve looked at the glass shard, looked at Beck, then turned back to the watch. She did not say thank you. She didn't need to, because between them, the most important things had never needed to be spoken aloud. Genevieve took a new piece of glass from the parts box at the corner of the table. She always kept replacement glass in different sizes, because she knew everything broke eventually, and a repairer had to be ready for that moment. She measured the glass, set it over the watch face, used a small knife to trim the edge until it fit the rim exactly, careful, precise, millimeter by millimeter. Then she fitted it in, tightened the retaining ring, tightened the screws on the back cover. Each movement was slow and even, the kind of evenness only someone who had done it thousands of times could have. Not rushed, but not wasted either. Every motion necessary, nothing extra, nothing missing. She set the watch down on the black velvet cloth. The new glass face was clear, reflecting the yellow light. The tarnished silver case still carried the old scratches and the new one, but it lay there, whole, complete, like something that had passed through battle and survived. She waited. 1 second, the room was silent. Beck sat across from her, not moving, not breathing hard, as if he too were waiting with her. 2 seconds. Then the sound came. Tick-tock. Small, light, but clear. Tick-tock. Tick-tock. The minute hand moved. Slowly, almost impossible to see with the eye, but it moved. The watch was running. The watch that, only a few hours earlier, had lain on the cold marble floor among broken plates and red wine, stepped on, its glass cracked, its hands dead, was now running again, lying on the black velvet cloth beneath the yellow light in her quiet apartment on the Lower East Side, ticking steadily, patiently, as if it had never stopped. Genevieve looked down at her hands. They were still resting on the table, her fingers slightly curved, the familiar calluses on the tips of her thumb and forefinger, and in the lines of her palms, under the lamp, if someone looked closely, there were still faint traces of red wine that washing her face had not fully removed, pale, dark streaks tucked into the creases of her skin, like a reminder that tonight had truly happened, that she had truly lain on the floor, that she had truly stood up, that she had truly opened her mouth and spoken. These hands, hands that spent years adjusting tiny gears, hands that had trembled on the penthouse floor, hands that had lifted her up when no one reached out, hands that had just repaired her mother's watch. She spoke softly, almost a whisper, almost only to herself, or to someone who had not been here for a very long time, yet whose voice still echoed inside every tick. Mom was right. Anything broken can run again. Beck reached across the table, not hurriedly. His hand opened, palm facing up, waiting. Genevieve placed her hand in his. A scarred hand held a calloused one. Both hands carried the marks of what had come before, neither smooth, neither perfect, but they fit together in the way only things that had endured together could fit. They sat there, without speaking. The ticking of the pocket watch filled the small room, light, steady, patient. Outside the window, New York was still awake, still noisy, still lit, still cruel to those who weren't loud enough, dazzling enough, rich enough, the right kind enough. The city did not change because of one night, because of one broken chair, because of one woman standing up in a penthouse. The city did not care. But in the 4th floor walk-up apartment on the Lower East Side, beside the laundromat and the old bookstore, beneath the pale yellow desk lamp, there was a woman who had just found her voice again. And the ticking of the old watch, small, steady, patient, The watch that had once stopped and was now running again sounded like the heartbeat of a heart that had just decided it would never be silent again. They thought their laughter would be what she remembered. They were wrong. She remembered the silence, the moment the whole room stopped breathing when she opened her mouth. Because once you have found your voice, no one can make you silent again. This is where the story ends. But before we say goodbye, I want to tell you something. Dignity is never measured by the dress you wear, the money in your account, or the way you hold a wine glass. Dignity is measured by how you treat others when you have power, and how you treat yourself when you have nothing. Each of us has once sat in our own chair that was about to break, has once felt small inside a room too large. But remember, standing up doesn't require anyone's permission. Your voice belongs to you, and once you choose to use it, no one can take it away. If this story touched you, I'd truly love to hear your feelings. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between staying silent and speaking up? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, because every story you tell is a source of inspiration we deeply treasure in our hearts. If you liked this video, please press like, share it with someone you think needs to hear this story, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories every day. We wish everyone watching this video very good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and love. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.